Dr. Seuss Goes to War. The World War II editorial cartoons of Theodore Seuss Geisel. With an introduction by Art Spiegelman, who is famous for, well, he's a famous cartoonist if you don't know about his comics. That's what I mean, for comics and graphic novels. He's the one who wrote Mouse in 2 volumes, which I think I've already done a video on. And the second one won a Pulitzer Prize, and it's in the news these days because some schools don't want to pull it from an 8th grade curriculum or something like that. Anyway, we won't talk too much about Spiegelman, but let's look at Dr. Seuss. The thing is, we recognize it right away, don't we? We recognize his style, but we don't recognize the content, because we usually don't see Dr. Seuss drawing swastikas and a bunch of little Hitlers. But that's what we have here. So he has written these editorial cartoons. This is before he was the Dr. Seuss that we know, the children's author. This was editorial cartoons in newspapers. He was very, very strongly against Adolf Hitler and against the world that Adolf Hitler was trying to build, which puts him on the right side of history, of course. He was against the isolationist feeling that was around a lot of the United States, that they didn't want to get in the war, that they wanted to stay home. He thought that that the United States needed to enter the war. I wasn't around at the time, and neither were most of you. And so these were some of his cartoons. One place he wasn't quite so on the right side of history is, and you might see it as I flip through some of these, is his treatment of the Japanese Americans, which is that he considered them to be a dangerous element in the United States. He considered them to be an enemy, whether they were citizens or not. Didn't seem to bother him too much. And I'm not sure whether you can see it's a little worse for wear here. I'm not sure whether he ever changed on that. I almost feel as though he did come out and say that he was wrong about that, but I'm not 100% sure. It's got this really cool paper side. I suppose I should mention the author, which is Richard H. Minear. So a lot of this is just the cartoons itself, and as you can see, I opened right up. But the cartoons themselves, but there is writing in here that gives you some context about some of these cartoons. Well, look, when I look at these cartoons, a lot of them are allusions to politicians and to events that I'm not really very up on. And so it's helpful to have that text. But just throughout, you can see that, again, it's jarring a little bit because it's very Dr. Seussian, but he is not writing Dr. Seuss kinds of things. Okay, he's testing Das new secret weapon for 1943. So I'll show you one that I think is really fascinating to me. Oh, look, it's right here. So I told you that he was not a fan of the isolationism. So here we are. The America First people were isolationists. They did not want to get into a foreign war. And she's reading her children, Adolf and the Wolf, and she says, "And the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children, and it really didn't matter." And that was his opinion of what the isolationist people were like, the America First people. Oh, well, they're foreigners. We don't care about them. Doesn't matter what happens to them. This is the appeaser's mirror. Look at yourself in despair. So if you want to you want to appease Hitler, and as you can see, he's sort of on the right side of Hitler. The right side of history here. Except that this was in 1941, long past the time when I ever heard of anyone thinking that appeasement was going to work in Europe. Way past that time. So I'm not even sure I understand what was going on in the United States at this time. This was just a couple of months before the Pearl Harbor, so the war was on. Anyway, it's just fascinating. It's really interesting. From a historical point of view, it's interesting from the idea that it was, a beloved children's author. Yeah, look, I found a four-leaf clover. So we figured, great, everything's good, and they're just not paying attention to anything that's happening elsewhere. This is what he felt throughout. He was just absolutely doing everything he could to convince people that what was happening in Europe was a terrible thing and you needed to help out. The dawdling producers. Now, this was after the US was already in the war, and he's saying you've got to do more. And I hear the dog next door howling, so maybe that's a sign that we're finished with this book. This one is Dr. Seuss Goes to War. Really, really interesting. By Richard H. Minear. But look, the big star is Theodore Geisel.